Hello, my name's David Runciman, and this is Past, Present, Future, the History of Ideas podcast. Today, in our series on the history of revolutionary ideas, I'm going to be talking to the historian of Haiti, Hank Gonzalez, about the Haitian Revolution, a slave revolution, and an incredibly rare one. It succeeded. We're going to be discussing who the revolutionaries were, who they were fighting against, what they were fighting for, and how they managed to pull it off. The Haitian Revolution is an extremely complicated event. This is a fast-moving conversation, as you will hear, and so that you can get into the flow of it, I thought, for once, it might be helpful just to do a very brief summary of the sequence of events that we're talking about. Part of the complexity here is the chronology. So this is just a short précis of what happened. We're talking about a place which is now called Haiti, but was in the 18th century called Saint-Domingue. It was a French colony, and it was built on sugar and slavery, mass chattel slavery. In August 1791, when the French Revolution was well underway, there was a slave uprising on Saint-Domingue, and it was at least partially successful, as well as being extraordinarily violent. By the following year, the rebels controlled about a third of the territory. In 1793, revolutionary France was at war with both Britain and Spain, which was still a monarchy, controlled the rest of the island of Hispaniola, and the Spanish decided to help, including to arm, the slave insurgents. So for a while at least, the revolutionaries in Saint-Domingue were fighting with, and occasionally in the name, of the Spanish king. In 1794, in its most radical phase, Republican revolutionary France announced the abolition of slavery in all of its territories. And at that point, the leader of the slave revolution in Saint-Domingue, a man called Toussaint Louverture, switched sides from the Spanish to the French. He was now fighting against slavery and for Republican France. As a result of that, the British decided to invade, to take on both the slaves, the slave rebels, in the name of upholding the institution of slavery, and also the French. That invasion was a disaster. It ended in defeat, partly through disease, and retreat. Then Napoleon tried again. In 1802, there was an invasion by Napoleonic France, and Napoleon had decided to reinstitute slavery. An invasion of Saint-Domingue. It also was an abject failure. It also resulted in defeat. So that, by 1804, the revolution had succeeded. Louverture was captured during the Napoleonic invasion, and he was taken back to France. Two of his generals succeeded him and became the first leaders of independent Haiti, a man called Dessalines and then a man called Henri Christophe. At the end of this story, it was the first time and the only time in human history that a slave uprising led to the creation of an independent, sovereign republic. That's the story that we're telling here. Let's start. Maybe to start, we should try and set the scene that lies behind the revolutionary events we're going to talk about. Is it possible to characterize how the place we're going to call Saint-Domingue, how it was governed in the 1780s? What was the political power structure? What was the economic power structure?
The way that it worked in the old regime was the privatized planter power over the privately owned slaves on each given estate and plantation and property. And so it was governed by this sort of stark autocracy of the planters, who therefore could do all these famous acts of sadism and terror and so forth. And officialdom would occasionally preserve the stories of the atrocities and the conflicts, poisoning scares, and who knows what else in the plantations. But they would often destroy those records too. So there's a lot we don't know from them sort of literally covering their own tracks in the 18th century.
But that slave plantation autocracy, what was the relationship pre-revolutionary Saint-Domingue between the slave owners with their extraordinary power in their little domain, and the French state, the pre-revolutionary French state. Were these people pretty much completely autonomous, or were they subject to colonial rule themselves?
Through gentlemanly capitalism and this marriage of aristocratic power and wealth with Creole power and wealth, they were integrated into court and the higher life of the old regime French establishment. So here you can get a glimpse at what the high aristocracy was doing as it would relate to the colonial wealth.
And what were they doing? So if you had to characterize this society, let's say in the 1780s, so pre the revolution in France, never mind pre the revolution that's coming on the island itself, how would you characterize the stability of that setup? Did they have a sense that they were presiding over something that was basically capable of blowing up at any moment, or did they feel that this was something that they had a pretty good handle on?
Was it thinkable to the planters that they could be standing atop some sort of Vesuvius? Yes, it was. It was thinkable to them, even though the unthinkable history idea is important. It was epistemically unimaginable to a quote-unquote white world. That's an important argument, but actually, no, it was thinkable because they had all these rebellions at all these different times. And also because Diderot and Abbé Raynal had asked the question of when a so-called Black Spartacus would emerge to avenge these crimes. And the word is that Louverture may have read that text as part of his early life literacy.
What then was the impact on the white ruling class in Saint-Domingue of the American Revolution? So there are lots of different ways of reading the American Revolution, but one way you could tell that story is here is a class of white slave-owning men who emancipate themselves from the old country, emancipate themselves from their colonial masters in Europe, and they create for themselves a republic which is independent, which is one in which they can control the economic and political structures, but they keep their slaves. Was that an inspiration to the people in Saint-Domingue, to the white slave-owning class, that there is a version of independence from France, from Europe, which is consistent with the perpetuation of the regime that they sat on the top of?
Not even just the revolution was necessary for them to get on board with the Yankee spirit of smuggling and free trade. So I like to point back to the 7 Years' War, when wartime trade blockades were causing these famines in the plantation zones of the Caribbean. And like the Brown family of Rhode Island would come down to Monte Cristi, just across the border, to smuggle molasses into their rum operation by fishing in the troubled waters and taking advantage of the spoils of war through smuggling. So even before American independence, these Dominican planters were dialed in to the formally illicit, non-mercantilist free trading networks that they'd had with the Yankees. So the concept that you could break free from l'exclusive, that you could break free from the tax regime, is obviously naturally tantalizing to these people. But there were 13 North American colonies, and by coincidence, there were 13 British slave Caribbean sugar colonies at the same time. And the clear argument is that the planters knew that they couldn't toy around, or else they would get what they would get in Haiti. They would get what would eventually end slavery in Cuba, wars of national independence / wars of liberation. And it's not as simple as all that, because the wars of national liberation in South America, your Venezuela, your Colombia, didn't actually upend slavery the way it ultimately would, for example, many generations later at the end of the second slavery in Cuba, when the war for independence would be mixed in as a war of emancipation and a kind of partial racial war. But the planters knew that they were atop a powder keg and they couldn't just go Creole independence, because they'd lose the naval and military last-ditch saving that they could get in the likely event of slave uprising. And we had situations like in 1733, when the entire island of St. John's and the Virgin Island was captured by insurgents for like 9 months. So the planters in the Caribbean had a sense of what could happen, which is why Alexander Hamilton successfully predicted the victory of the Haitian insurgents once it was the real War of Independence, and which is why figures in Jamaica would predict that the Haitian Revolution was going to go the way it was going. They were watching, would predict what this would have been like, the kind of perma-war, permanent irregular war of survival that was this Caribbean slavery gulag nightmare landscape, which is partly why the beauty of the Caribbean, this glistening turquoise waters and so forth, and all the tourism is so jarring in a way, because this is all a big graveyard.
So for the plantation class, calling it a dilemma is too tame given the language you've just been using. We're talking about a gulag and a graveyard. But the dilemma is that they need French protection because they are on the edge of what is almost a permanent state of potential warfare over this economy, over the trade on which they depend. And the British are there. Just to declare independence is not to make yourself free, it's to make yourself vulnerable. They need the protection of the French state. What then happens when the French state has its revolution? So post 1789, how does that change the calculus on Saint-Domingue about what's possible? This is a revolution undertaken in the name of the rights of man, but certainly in 1789, everyone can see this is not a particularly capacious concept. It doesn't include all sorts of people. What do the people on Saint-Domingue think has been changed about the calculus of power there?
You kept referring to how they need the French state protection. Until they don't, until the French state becomes a firebrand of racial emancipation, as it does after 1794, and starts exporting the revolution all through the Caribbean. Like, most people don't know about how the British governor of Grenada was put through the sugar mill as retribution during the civil wars that were occurring on a racial emancipation, British versus French basis in all the small islands. But see, the big planters who we're talking about, if the French state was going to turn against them, and they're basically in the aristocracy, they're Miami Cubans, they're at Coblence, they're white Russians in exile, they need the protection of then the British state. And so they become famously the turncoat planters. They go for the appel aux Anglais. And so the Baron de Malouet and the Vicomte de Charmilly, to give you perspective on how it was high aristocracy that was really at the helm of the sugar miracle of the French at Saint-Domingue, they go Burkean, and they reach out to Pitt to engineer and contrive the disastrous invasion of Saint-Domingue by Britain. So they need their property protected, and they're going to go conservative and join Britain. That's a huge part of the whole story.
And they're going to go conservative and join Britain from the off, or does it depend on? So the French Revolution moves through its stages. In 1792, the French National Assembly extends citizenship rights to non-white French citizens. In 1794, it issues an emancipation decree to end slavery. At what point in that story, we're going to get onto the perspective of the slaves themselves, but at what point in that story do the people who are running the old regime in Saint-Domingue realize that France is now the enemy? Does it require the republic to have moved through its stages so that it becomes a republic of racial emancipation, or is it, does it start with the revolution itself?
No, the Republic of Racial Emancipation thing is what really got them. It was 16 Pluviots of year 2, February 4th of 1794. There's a gouache or a sketch of the event. And of course, the famous painting of the Jean-Baptiste Mars Bellet, survivor of the Middle Passage, first African legislator in Europe. That moment is what frosts it. Because famously in that moment, I hear you've been talking about Robespierre, you may talk about Danton, you talk about these people. They aren't abolitionists at first, of course, because the abolitionists originally, the ones collaborating with Clarkson and Equiano, were the Brissotins. So because of Brissot, and because Brissot eventually becomes purged and canceled as a reactionary because it's associated with the Girondins, so then abolitionism is out. And that's why like Robespierre, Danton are not known as abolitionists because of that political layout. But once the emancipation passes by acclaim in the National Convention, the famous quip, I believe, of Robespierre is, quote, "Pitt is finished," which then draws the map to you for why Pitt and the British were the only choice for the old regime, old guard, upper plantocracy of Saint-Domingue. That's why they joined Britain, and that's why Britain invaded and spent so much treasure and lost so much in the quote-unquote West India graveyard of the Saint-Domingue invasion episode.
So that's what forced the issue for the slave holders. What about for the slave population of Saint-Domingue? Just to give us a sense of perspective, just tell us what the sort of population proportions were here. How many slaves are we talking about on the island relative to how many whites?
Supposedly like 500,000 people enslaved, roughly. We don't fully know, obviously. There was a lot of smuggling. The initial leader of the uprising is a perfect example of this, Boukman. Was he literate? Was he the bookman? Boukman was trafficked in from Jamaica. So we don't know how many people were there fully, but maybe 500,000 slaves, 480,000, who knows? And then how many whites? Not that, like 30,000-ish. How many mixed race and free blacks? So gens de couleur, or people of color, gens de couleur would be most often associated with mulatto, mixed race, mulat. Of course, it's a canceled term because it means mule, but it's still used everywhere. And so those people are iconically associated with being the free people of color, and they're extraordinarily significant for the whole Haitian Revolution story and for Haiti's subsequent history when they sort of reconstitute themselves as a narrow, hated, and snobbish elite. But they were, 40,000, 35,000 of them? So 500,000 enslaved to like 30,000 whites, something of that nature.
And 35,000 free people of color.
Which would also include fully black people like Louverture, who were free.
And the so-called, in the term, free people of color, before we get onto the slave uprising itself, when the French Revolution happened, and as the French Revolution moved through its phases of emancipation, first of all extending rights to non-white French citizens and then moving to a full abolitionist position, how did that shape their understanding of what was possible? So never mind the enslaved for now, but for the non-white but non-enslaved population of Saint-Domingue, when they saw what was going on in France, when they saw the plantation class move away from France and towards Britain as the only people who can protect them, where did they stand? I say they, lots of variety in that story.
They includes a lot of big figures, right? Like Julien Raymond, like André Rigaud, and then crucially here, Vincent Auger. So there's an order to it. The quote-unquote mulattoes rose up in arms, inspired by the turbulent situation going on and by the calls for their political emancipation. They rose up in arms first. It was 1790 that Vincent Auger and his associate Chavannes would rise in arms to be defeated, broken on the wheel, and they weren't trying to raise the slaves.
So they were trying to emancipate their class, which stood between the plantation aristocracy and the enslaved, in the name of the revolution, in the name of the rights of man?
I think in the name of the rights of man, even in the name of the gradual abolitionism that they were involved in. So they were already involved in the Société des Amis de Noir. And they were in Cambridge, for example. Just like Equiano was in Cambridge dealing with Clarkson, Auger was in Cambridge dealing with Clarkson. They were planning. So Auger was planning with British forces. And then things would then take their course when the real explosion broke off. But that was sort of the order of it. And Auger was captured and broken on the wheel.
So the real explosion is the 1791 slave uprising. What triggered it?
Slavery. August of 1791, August 21st, there may have been a planning meeting the week before. Documents keep getting more and more keeps getting known, and more publishing keeps coming out. So it seems that we have more details about the immediate precursor context, runaways and maroon activity before in the North in the 1780s leading up. But they had a meeting. Drivers, coachmen, more powerful and privileged slaves within the plantation hierarchy. Always recall that if someone was being whipped in a place like this, it was usually a enslaved person doing the whipping, or that's sort of in charge of running the work gangs. They would sort of leverage this relative mobility and this experience of leading people and the life and death kind of lifestyle of survival in the plantation economy. And they would plot and they would plan the greatest slave rebellion and conspiracy that ever was, which broke out August 21st to 22nd in the North.
And when it broke out, if the slave owners at this point were simply calculating their best chances of survival, who they had to ally themselves with, if the freed non-white population were staking a claim to their own emancipation in the name of the rights of man, the slave uprising was being done in the name of what? It was being done in the name of emancipation from slavery. But in the context of the revolution, did they see this as an extension of the French Revolution? Did they look to the American Revolution and see that actually the independence movement was itself a way of perpetuating slavery, and this needed to be done, therefore, in the name of the monarchical regimes? In whose or what name was this uprising done?
The analogous figures doing things in honor of the monarchical regimes, the stars of that are like the Llaneros of Venezuela, who at different times were like a renegade force pro-Spain at times. We were shifting loyalties. This is all about the question of forces and then the volte-face. The same way the planters could turn against France because they needed to protect their property, enslaved people would turn against France, towards Spain, against Spain again once France changed its policy, and then eventually against all the European powers and for independence, although that was actually sort of a turn towards a British neo-colonialism of sorts, when the British sort of engineered neo-colonialism towards the end in their relations with the now independent Haiti under their partial strategic supervision. But what would they rise in the name of? They would rise in the name of survival, desperation, and life and death. It was one of these life and death kind of things. They were being worked to death. So they had to kill the masters if they had any basic prayer for their own survival, autonomy, let alone sort of self-realization, sovereignty, etc. So it was a life and death explosion, like a prison uprising gone completely bananas. It was something like that. And in the name of, some ideas of equality are circulating. There was a big major political assembly in the main northern capital of the Cap. So they may have been trying to do a real kill shot, take the city. Forget about taking advantage of the ideas of the French Revolution. How about the fact that the ideas are getting all the whites to get together and meet? Let's rise then and kill all of them then. That was part of the idea. And then the old idea was that, it's a plot that the monarchists sowed. The monarchists must have been doing this to undermine the Republic and the Revolution. That doesn't seem to hold too much credence. But are they doing it in the name of the King of Congo? As maybe some source indicates, some of them would have had these kind of ideas. And the key thing to remember is how they wound up in the slave ships is they were often already warriors. And the voodoo encodes this in songs about, the god of the forge and the war and being trapped in the hell of war. So they would jump from the hell of war and slavery in Africa into the hell of the barracoons and the seasoning, through the hell of the slave ship, and enter the very deadly hell of the plantation production. And so they're being sort of buffeted about from one forced, conscripted, unfree, dangerous condition to another. And so the songs will record, I'm already a warrior. I'm already in the war. Yo m'étais m'veillé, déjà garçon la guerre. I'm already a warrior. So there was a kind of a continuity in violent, desperate struggle for survival that exploded in Saint-Domingue. And so they could already be in secret societies of voodoo. Voodoo drumming, voodoo oaths would inspire and condition this major uprising and a lot of the stuff that came after.
Is it possible to say that August 1791, nonetheless, so as you said, you can see this as like a prison uprising and anything can spark that. And yet the timing doesn't just look coincidental. August 1791, in the middle of a revolution in France, which has destabilized conditions on the island already. Some of this must also have been a form of, among some of the people who ended up leading this movement, political calculation that the time was right, that this had a chance of success because the revolution in France had destabilized the order on Saint-Domingue.
It had. And again, as I say, they're meeting. They're having a giant meeting. Let's go. Let's go crash that meeting. And they didn't succeed in crashing the meeting. The whites held the town in a very desperate scramble. But the countryside was done for the whites. The mountains. And then the insurgents would filter eastward into the Spanish colony by the borderlands. And the Spanish, who were relatively hopeless all along in production, in shipping, in demographics, had a long-standing colonial habitus or pattern of sponsoring their rivals' black insurgents as desperately needed troops and border guards. So the Spanish had already been doing this in Florida, in Saint-Domingue. And so the Spanish, I'm sure with a lot of unease and trepidation, would grant epaulettes, weapons, money, rank, formal inclusion in the Spanish military to some of the first key military leaders of this uprising. So Buchmann died early. I think Buchmann may have died in November. And it was all these melees and all these engagements. But then the surviving big military leaders, Georges Biassou, Jean-François, and for a time, a guy named Jeannot Boulet were some of the top early military leaders, and they got commissioned by the Spanish. At some point, Jeannot got killed. But in that grouping, at a lower level, under Biassou and Jean-François, were Louverture, and under him, close associates, Christophe, Dessalines, and Moïse. And they got commissioned in the Spanish military, and that's how they were fighting for some time. And they were drilling and getting formally militarized.
Did the Spanish recruitment offer include emancipation?
Most certainly not. Apparently, early on, some of these leaders tried to parlay and tried to get some really minor terms. No more work on Saturdays, no more lash, and amnesty and freedom for like the top few hundred leaders. Those were terms they'd come to the planters with, and the white planters were intransigent. But it was quite a strategic political situation, and the French planters rejected them out of hand.
We'll come back to this, but my question was about when they were recruited by the Spanish, and they were therefore fighting against the French planters, in part on behalf of their rival Spanish colonial competitors. Did the Spanish offer anything by way of liberation or emancipation in return for this?
The Spanish, who had started the whole disaster with the 1492 and the encomienda and started with the African slave trade into the Americas, were also the last to stop it in 1886 in Cuba.
And so there was no sense at this point that these colonial rivalries, if it's going to involve mobilizing an insurgent slave army who are rising up for freedom, that the price of that might end up having to be the end of slavery. There was no sense on the part of any of the European powers at this point that that might be the price that would have to be paid.
No, but some of the insurgents had already seen the Declaration of the Rights of Man, and some of the insurgents were referring to it. Here, I think we had Biassou maybe, and we had maybe Charles Belair in like 1792 going around saying, we want the rights of man like they have in France. So there was already the stirrings of people looking towards some of that would come to massive fruition in 1793 with Sonthonax.
But in 1792, the complication of this story is that the people who are fighting for the rights of man that they have become aware of are nonetheless fighting against the French on behalf of the Spanish, who have no interest in the rights of man.
Not all of them. General Pierrot, I'm not sure that he was ever involved with the Spanish. It's a chaotic landscape of insurgency, shattered and crazy. And so some areas, there's different band leaders, and they're not all under the camp of the Spanish. They're out doing stuff. You got a lot of bodies and a few crazy survivors in this extended story.
Where do the British fit in at this point? So prior to 1794, where are the British at that point? Before Robespierre says Pitt is finished, what is Pitt thinking?
They're not in it yet. Because there's literally a buddy pick Hollywood thing about Pitt and Wilberforce's great friendship. Pitt is one of the many sacred cows. Pitt, Pepys, all kind of people that people didn't really associate with being slavers. Pitt statue, Pitt building, Pitt tureen, Pitt silver, Pitt everything. People don't associate him with struggling to re-enslave the Haitians. But he did his best, and he got clocked.
After 1794, after the French Republic has announced the abolition of slavery in French-controlled territories, that's the point at which the British get involved. What is the status at that point of the uprising on the island? Is there any sense at that point that anyone knows who's in charge?
Well, 1793 has happened. So 1793 is the key thing where Sonthonax arrives. Sonthonax, Paul Varel, and Ailot, the three civil commissioners, are sent in by, I guess, the National Assembly government to try to restore order and to try to enact the May 1792 law that you're mentioning about enfranchising the free people of mixed and black descent in the hope that they will defend the order. That's the mission they came in on. But when they got there, the situation on the ground was nearly untenable. So when they got to the Cap, the royalists conspired against them. A certain naval, maybe admiral or somebody called Galbaud. And that became the Affaire Galbaud. And the Affaire Galbaud was a big deal. They tried to arrest Sonthonax or send him back to France or something. And the royalists and the planters were rising up against Sonthonax. And so Sonthonax decided he had only one chance to save the colony for France, the way he'd be thinking of it. And he, in the midst of tumult in the capital, negotiated with Pierrot and maybe others who had armed men in the hills. And he said, we're going to do general emancipation. That was August of 1793.
So emancipation came first in Saint-Domingue.
In the colony. That's right. And now with that, you could have some reorientation of the radical forces maybe towards France. But then once the 1794 decree hit, then the news hit Louverture. And that's when Etienne Lavaux, the French general, gets into negotiations with Louverture. And Louverture realizes he's going to switch and join the tricolor. which could, of course, symbolize white, black, and mulatto unity to eventually be crushed by the Haitian reality and then the Haitian flag becoming just the blue and the red for black and mulatto unity, which also hasn't worked out. But that's how it happened, is that once there was the policy in Paris, Lavaux was able to sell that to Louverture, and then Louverture does the volte-face in 1794, and Louverture rallies his people to join the French side and then goes back into the Saint-Domingue area and starts winning all these wars. And not all of them did the volte-face. Biassou and Jean-François stayed with the Spanish to later be carefully kept under guard when passing through Havana. Biassou was sent to go be a military guy at St. Augustine, Florida.
Is it possible to describe the direction of travel? So as you talk about it, we have in 1793, commissioners sent from France to reimpose the old order and discover that's impossible. And the only basis for negotiation is to offer emancipation. And so emancipation comes first there, it travels back, news travels back, and then you get emancipation in Paris. And when the news of emancipation in Paris travels back, then you get Louverture and others switching sides. So it goes back and back and back. It crosses the Atlantic. The idea of freedom crosses first from west to east, and then it comes back. And it's when it comes back as the official policy of the revolutionary regime that the leaders of the slave uprising realize that some of them, that they can now do this in the name of the French Republic.
Bingo. And again, with limited resources on the ground, the French Republic starts doing this thing, exporting the revolution. So if you could think Dzerzhinsky and the Comintern, you could think the Third International in the teens and 20s, and then also like Fidel, the way Fidel would try to really export the revolution by supporting insurgents, sending in people, sending Guevara everywhere. Mille Vietnams igual, as Guevara used to call for. The exporting the revolution concept was perhaps most turbulently and insanely applied by the French Republic in the wider Caribbean in the 1795, 6, 7, 8, especially 7, 8, 9 timeframes, when they sent another civil commissioner called Victor Hugues into Guadeloupe, where he would then send these canoes full of firebrands into St. Lucia, Dominica, St. Vincent, Grenada, where they would have these wars. The whole Garifuna saga passes through this foundational moment from St. Vincent. The Garifuna ethnicity of Central America is one of these most exilic, shattered, and displaced bearers witness. Certain ethnicities, languages, and people are the real witnesses to all these stuffs. So like their language, like the Haitian Creole language, the Haitian Creole culture, zeitgeist, sayings, voodoo liturgy is all like the record of this. The way surely the Garifuna language of Central America is also another record of this Haitian revolutionary moment. The Black Caribs of Dominica or Kalinago, the Garifuna in St. Vincent, were the mixed Black indigenous people who rose up and fought with France against England for emancipation. And when they got defeated by England, they were exiled to some tiny little island off St. Vincent where half of their number were starved to death. And then interestingly, Britain didn't just choose to kill them all. Britain actually then cast them onto the Central American shore, where maybe they would make some sort of deals with the Mosquito people and they would be allowed to live and they would grow their people and their culture to where there's now like millions of these Garifuna in countries like Honduras, Guatemala, Belize. They're this whole ethnic group that are the witness and the legacy of this.
So how do we get from the point that we've reached in the Haitian, the Saint-Domingue story, to independence? It has to pass through, first of all, the defeat in this context, though not in the wider context of the British. And then it has to pass through the defeat of Napoleon's attempt to reassert the slave-owning order on the island. So first of all, how does this uprising, which is now being undertaken in the name of the Republic, how does it survive against the British threat?
It defeats the British just through the same sort of tactics of, how do you defeat your enemy? You meditate by the river and wait for his body to float by. So there became this survival and war of evasion, runaway stuff. So they were up in the hills running away. The big part of the Caribbean historic memory and zeitgeist is the Congolese expression that you get from the Cuban culture, bruca manigua, yengere bruca manigua, meaning run away to the mountain. If you see the man, you run away from the man. Run when you see the man, run see man. That was the Congolese concept, yengere bruca manigua. And so they're running away into the hills, living these sort of maroon-like survival existences as armed bands called brigands, of course, by the French.
But that's not enough to get the British off and away. They had to be defeated. So it's disease as well.
It is because of the powers of disease. Well, remember, so on the one hand, you get this kind of whining loser syndrome where, of course, the British and the French and everybody tries to call it up for a mulligan and call asterisk and say we were defeated by the disease. We weren't defeated militarily by the blacks. It was both. And the blacks were timing stuff to deal with the disease element, the yellow fever and the malaria. Not precisely germ warfare, just cyclical knowledge of the tropics and what it would do to devastate these unseasoned European forces brought in by the tens of thousands to die like flies.
And was Louverture by this point the leader of this? I mean, so you run away into the hills, but what kind of leadership structure did the uprising have at this point?
Military agriculture, military centralized rule. Louverture was the leader of all of that. Louverture was the leader of getting production back off the ground on the basis of sharecropping. And again, the state-directed agriculture that I'm talking about. Laurent Dubois theorizes it as quote-unquote Republican racism. You're not a slave anymore, you're a cultivator. We're not going to beat you with whips, we're going to beat you with ropes. There's no more chains, we're going to tie people up tight like a twist of tobacco. And so there'd be uprisings, there'd be plantation uprisings all the time, against Louverture sometimes. That's how Louverture apparently got shot in the leg. So he's administering and running these plantations while winning all these wars, defeating the British. And then, of course, as the whole thing is defined by its internal wars, niche theory, like fights like. So he has his rival. He has his mulatto rival in the South, André Rigaud. André Rigaud is maybe more pro-French in a way than Louverture. And so Louverture defeats Rigaud in a civil war in the 1798-ish time frame called the War of Knives. And of course, the Yankees are in that. The Yankees are supporting Louverture by 1798-99. All this exporting the revolution, turbulence time stuff I'm talking about involves corsair warfare where the French are arming corsairs to capture any trade, including slave ships, sometimes capturing slave ships and quote-unquote freeing the people, sometimes into French agricultural projects in Saint-Domingue at times. But basically, the U.S. creates its Navy in this time partially for this reason. The U.S. Navy was founded. And they went down and they blockaded Jacmel to support Louverture against Rigaud. This is sort of a not properly known but important dynamic. And apparently they fired as well. So I think we might have the Yankee imperialists firing their guns overseas for the first time in history in 1798, intervening in the Haitian Revolution.
And what did Louverture mean to them?
Free trade and being broken away from France because they were already into it with France in this phase called the quote-unquote quasi-war. U.S. relations with revolutionary France are obviously an interesting topic. Citizen Genet, early enthusiasm donning the cockade in American circles in Philadelphia and New York, turning to a cooling of enthusiasm once you get the guillotine, the lantern, and the terror. And so it's complicated, but the Americans were fighting France. And so they took Louverture's side the way the British would de facto kind of ultimately take Louverture's side once they signed their retreat agreement with him. That was the General Maitland, who essentially created neocolonialism in his dealings with Louverture upon defeat. He realized they couldn't win, and so they had to win the peace by setting up trade deals and strategic deals with Louverture. Crucially, getting Louverture and later his successors, Dessalines and Christophe, to agree to never trouble the order in Jamaica.
So there wasn't a fear, for instance, from the Americans that the exporting of the revolution by taking sides in a civil war, but taking the side of one leader of a slave uprising against another leader of a slave uprising, there wasn't a fear that this would spread north and that it risked the order in the United States.
Well, it did. It did in 1811 in the largest slave uprising in U.S. history at the German coast in Louisiana, where Charles Deslandes led a big uprising. He'd been a trafficked person from Saint-Domingue. So you have a veteran of the Haitian Revolution, Charles Deslandes, leading the biggest slave uprising in the history of the U.S. And indeed, there was a lot of fear and trepidation. One of the big ideas was, oh my God, slaves straight from Africa are dangerous as hell. Take a look. Look, they're warriors. Oh God. And so the U.S. would stop and slow some importation of slaves. They would pass laws partially prohibiting it in places like South Carolina for a time. So there was some serious concern. And as I say, 1811 proves that the concerns were not unfounded.
But not so serious as to give them pause. They ended up supporting a successful slave revolution. I mean, that's what you describe them doing.
Through trade. You know what Dessalines said? This is apocryphal. I don't know if it's true, but it's all about the money, man. So like Dessalines was like, the whites, anyone who's worried that if we kill all the whites, they'll stop trading with us, very poorly understands the whites. You see, if I go by the custom house and I have a hanging balance there, if I hang a white man by one side of the balance and then hang sacks of coffee on the other whites will show up and buy the coffee. You got to get that morning Joe. You got to get that dough. And that's how it worked. It was trade relations. And the French would, of course, go nuts and say, God damn it. It is the British and the Americans and who knows who, the Dutch, who knows who else is bringing the gunpowder in. God darn it. Dessalines would try to make his own gunpowder manufacture at a certain point. I'm not sure that it really got off the ground, but it would show that strategic side during the period of the great fortress building of the Haitians.
A term that sometimes applied to Louverture is that he was the Haitian Robespierre. Sometimes he's described as the Haitian Napoleon. This regime, this proto-regime that he is presiding over, which, as you say, economically requires him to reinstitute the old economic model. He has to get these plantations working again, and that requires quite a lot of coercive control. What kind of a political leader was he in the end?
You know, he spoke Arada because his father taught him to speak Arada. His father may have been captured from the capture of Ouida. A lot of this Haiti stuff focuses on the Bight of Benin and the region of Dahomey and Ouida. Now, it has a lot to do with Congo and other areas. It's not that it was a very, very mixed setting, but his father was maybe some kind of a nobleman. So he may have been raised, he was a regal person. He would speak Arada so he could deal and understand and know the recently arrived Africans very closely. So he was definitely one of these charismatic leaders. He was always going around everywhere. So in this sense, like a Fidel comparison, he's around, he's showing up, he's administering hands-on. People like the idea of how fast he would travel on a horse across distances. How kind of leader was he? He was a famous leader, that's for sure. His regime was a regime. It had a constitution. He minted his own coins, the Louverture and Escalin. They're extremely rare. They're rare as hen's teeth, the Louverture coins. He did all kinds of stuff.
What kind of a constitution was it?
Sort of French Republican-ish. But then the question there was, because the whole thing formally was, I'm governing for France, I'm loyal to France, this is my French regime. But it was his own regime. And is he the Napoleon, is he this, is he that? I believe the line from his letter to Napoleon was, from the first of the blacks to the first of the whites. So he saw himself as the supreme leader of the blacks. That was his terms, from the first of the to the first of the. And then, of course, people were like, oh, well, Napoleon didn't like that, so he decided he was going to,
He decided he was going to invade.
He decided he was going to invade, send his brother-in-law, General Leclerc, and his second-in-command, Rochambeau, and however many tens of thousands of soldiers, including some conscripts from continental Europe. And he would send them in there in droves to try to crush this spirit of freedom. And they would get in there, and there would be war about it. And it was a whole complicated, tenuous period of back and forth. Who's with the French, who's not. For times, the Dessalines was with the French. And the French would go around saying, Dessalines a key to us. Dessalines the only weapon we have to control these uprisings. And if Dessalines indeed was biding his time, winnowing and pruning the ranks of the rebels, going after rivals in the name of France to build his plan. And Louverture, of course, was hoodwinked, bamboozled, fugazied into being captured at some kind of false parley. And so he was sent off to die in the Jura Mountains in the Alps or wherever of cold.
At which point it becomes Dessalines' revolution.
Basically, he becomes the leader from 1803-ish, and he then pushes the final thrust for independence, and he theorizes the independent Haitian nation state that's meant to avenge the crimes of colonialism.
So what kind of a state, then, did he imagine he was creating? And this story ends with independence. This is now an independent state.
It's now the Empire of Haiti under Emperor Jean-Jacques Dessalines, Emperor Jean-Jacques I.
Modeled on Emperor Napoleon?
Good question. Because Christophe's regime lasted so much longer, which is the real torchbearer that carried on from Dessalines in the north, because Christophe's regime lasted so much longer, we know that it was modeled on the British aristocracy, which is why it had the heraldry and the nobility. So the abolitionists were horrified by the Haitian Revolution. They would maybe allude to it as the kind of thing that they were all trying to prevent all along. So they had regimes, and the regimes were partially influenced by a certain admiration and interest in Britain and British elite and the British kingdom and so forth.
How did independent Haiti, in its formation, think it could be emancipated, not simply from slavery that had happened, but from the economic system that slavery had upheld, the plantation system. How was that meant to be escaped from simply by independence?
Well, for the ordinary people, it would be escaped from through an endless struggle on all fronts to not be taxed, not be beaten, not be confined, not be broke, not be poor. So the ordinary people would take land, squat, run away. They would go and figure out rural lifeways outside the power of this new state and these new states, which were all committed to the plantation system. But did they have the vision that said we would have to do something besides the plantation system? So what would happen is that coffee, being less capital intensive, less labor intensive, was favored. Even the people would like harvest a semi-feral coffee, the maquis caféière that would sort of grow out of the ruins. And then they would harvest dyewood to sell. But at times, Dessalines would come around repressing that. Burn all the dyewood. I need sugar business. I need coffee business. So they were supposed to be doing all this plantation stuff. And I always ask about the gold because, of course, Hispaniola has more gold than any other place in the Caribbean. That's why the biggest mine for Barrick is in Dominican Republic. And that's why the Columbus stuff was all there. And so I often wonder, because I see sometimes people, ordinary people in Haiti, panning for gold in the north, like on a ditch in the middle of nowhere. I wonder if those generals ever had a thought of trying to mine gold for their strategic military statecraft. And I kind of think that probably with whatever methods they had and whatever tech and capital they had, which wasn't much, the good gold in the north of Haiti that was accessible to those methods of those times had already been mined out by the Spanish. That would have been like one of the biggest alternatives. And I don't know that they even tried specifically.
Because that was what I was going to ask you, whether when you look at this story as a whole, so what you've described, if you take this from 1789 through the next decade and a half, it's an incredibly complicated story of back and forth and twists and turns. It ends with liberation, emancipation, and independence, but it also ends with an economy and an island story that feels like it's trapped. And it's trapped in a future that you can still see today. It's trapped in poverty, apart from anything else. In that story, the revolutionary story, do you see forks in the road? So there's gold, but do you see other forks in the road where this could have ended differently?
Maybe with the 1,000 Vietnams in the Caribbean, if they'd been able to do that. And they tried in the small islands. You got to think of the idea of an ongoing, unending struggle. Because, in 1605 at Colombia, Banco Bioho escaped soon after being brought in enslaved and went and founded the Palenque, the free Maroon autonomous community. Of all these big Maroon things that are not like a whole Maroon country like Haiti, the easiest one to visit touristically is the Palenque by Cartagena, where the Colombian police station is unmanned and the flag is down because of the autonomy of that group since 1605. And these peoples in the Guyanas, multiple of them, these Maroon peoples, or again, the Garifuna who I'm mentioning, they have degrees of sovereignty, degrees of power, degrees of national and cultural interiority and self-reproduction through language. And they're right there, trying not to have their land taken, trying not to have their language destroyed.
But it didn't happen because it was impossible in the end to escape the European grand power conflicts that were shaping this period?
At the wider level, it would be impossible because eventually the Yankee miracle comes and the Yankees come in and invade Haiti, take it over, disarm the people, unmake Dessalines' key constitutional thing that says no foreigner shall own land here, no white man shall be in Haiti in the capacity of master. The Yankees and Franklin Delano Roosevelt flipped that over. Roosevelt was happy to boast that he'd written the new Haitian Constitution. So eventually that becomes the defeat. And then, of course, we have the whole question of the 1825 indemnity, which we're obviously not going to get into. That's become quite a field nowadays. Nothing like a bicentennial to get one of the biggest topics going. And the Haitians are doing a lot to discuss 1825 and to try to dig into it. A lot of these stories are just ongoing with the Palenque, with the Guyanas, with the Garifuna, with Caribbean sovereignty in general across a zillion different contexts and across a whole archipelago of struggles of people to hold on to what they may have and to get more.
But in the absence of the 1,000 Vietnams, in the absence of a generalized multiple series of uprisings, do you think that what happened on Saint-Domingue, what happened in Haiti, in the end, it reached the limits of what was possible then? In this period of revolutionary politics in France, of great power politics, the wars, the European wars that spread around the world, in that context, was this the limit of what was possible?
It reached extraordinary success if measured by the living conditions of many of the Haitian people through the 19th century. If measured by the living conditions of a lot of Haitian people, especially knowing that slavery does not end in Brazil till 1888, it's heaven and earth. And for some people, they constructed a heaven of freedom.
Is it possible to calibrate that? So living conditions, relatively speaking, what are we talking about here?
Not just getting raped all the time, not just starving completely to death, that sort of stuff. Speaking your own language, doing your own religion, that sort of thing. Those were successful achievements.
And if you time slice this story towards the end of the 19th century, the arc of it is a success, would you say? And it's the 20th century that undoes it.
I look to all crises to try to read them as crises of success. Something was working, and then how did it go wrong? And what was working is they were having a demographic explosion. They were having free children in vast numbers. And they were successful at getting a small farming model that was highly autonomous and highly variegated and highly robust and highly autarkic almost in terms of supplying a lot of the people's needs. And that would eventually hit a kind of Malthusian wall where the land ran out. That was kind of how it happened.
And when would we date that?
By the late 19th century, you got to figure.
So in the end, it was the limits of doing this as an autonomous model.
It was the limits of what land Haiti had. Haiti's the size of Maryland. Haiti's the size of Maryland, and the land is super rich and productive, and they actually would start to get 40 acres and a mule, and they would grow a lot, and they would create somewhat prosperous lifestyles and social institutions on that basis.
But that model couldn't be integrated into a wider economy.
That model was what other plantation colonies would have been horrified. The fun part about this is that nowadays they're seen as bad environmental stewards for having cut down every last tree. In those times, they were decried also on the similar hateful racial grounds for being overgrown, vine-choked. The forests were growing up where there had once been wonderful sugar plantations. And then, but eventually then, with no energy source other than burning wood and the fast-growing population, they would again then take up all the land that there was and all the resources that there were in this meager, rudimentary domestic economy.
Could you say in the end that the problem was this was a kind of genuine independence? They fought to free themselves from everybody. The story that you described, this is freedom from the plantation owners, then breaking away from the Spanish, defeating the British, then defeating the French, defeating Napoleon. Eventually, this island state achieves a kind of independence. It's sort of hard in this period to think of anything comparable. It's genuine independence, but that means it also, later on, the bill is going to be paid later on, but later on, it's very hard then to plug it back into all of those forms of economic and political life that it had emancipated itself from.
Unless they had mined the gold. And again, I'm not certain that they could have.
We wanted to remind you that we have a live event coming up. It's going to be a live recording of the podcast at the Bath Curious Minds Festival on the 29th of March. I'm going to be talking to regular PPF guest and contributor Robert Saunders about the legacy of Winston Churchill, the politician with 9 lives. We're going to try and work out who he really was and what he really means for British history. Do join us for that. All you need to do is go to the events page on our website and you can find out how to be there. Also, a reminder that the latest edition of our fortnightly newsletter will be out tomorrow, and it will include, among other things, more of a guide to the Haitian Revolution. Next time, something a bit different. I'm going to be talking to the statistician David Spiegelhalter about a revolution in statistics, in maths, that changed the world. It started in the 18th century. It is connected to the French Revolution. It only really revealed its revolutionary effects in the 20th and 21st centuries. It is known as the Bayesian Revolution. David Spiegelhalter will explain all. That's next time. This has been Past, Present, Future, part of the Airwave Podcast Network.